Welcome, friends, to another edition of the Economic Lens, where we take a closer look at the stories shaping our world, not through headlines, but through the structures behind them. I'm glad to have you with us. Before we begin, a few brief notes. Our next lecture series on global trade and the fracture of alliances begins next month at McGill University. And for those who've been asking, yes, the new report on economic nationalism in the age of green technology will be released later this week. Now, let's turn to today's story, one that has been brewing quietly yet carries enormous implications for the balance of power across the Pacific. Canada and China, two nations whose relationship has swung between cooperation and confrontation, appear, at least for now, to be inching back from the edge. After years of strain marked by diplomatic freezes, sanctions, and mutual suspicion, something unexpected is unfolding. Ottawa's foreign minister is reportedly preparing to travel to Beijing. The meeting, though framed as routine dialogue, could signal something far more significant, the beginning of a thaw, a cautious, calculated attempt to rebuild trust, or perhaps to renegotiate leverage. But as with all diplomatic gestures, timing tells the real story. Because this potential rapprochement comes after months of escalating trade pain. It's not just about diplomacy, it's about desperation, economics, and the shifting loyalties of a country caught between two empires. It began, as major turning points often do, not with fanfare, but with a whisper. A message marked confidential, quietly transmitted from Beijing to Ottawa. Inside, a proposal so audacious it left even seasoned negotiators stunned. China's ambassador offered what's now being called the Golden Deal, a full removal of tariffs on Canadian agriculture, canola, pork, seafood, every one of them, in exchange for one thing, that Canada lift its 100% import ban on Chinese electric vehicles. No phased negotiations, no gradual roadmap, just an immediate trade swap. On paper, it looked almost poetic. We'll buy your food if you buy our cars. But beneath that simplicity lay a profound question, one that goes beyond economics. Is this an act of reconciliation or a test of allegiance? To understand what's at stake, we have to rewind. When Donald Trump returned to the White House, his administration launched a new wave of tariffs against Chinese industries, particularly electric vehicles. The stated goal was to protect American manufacturing from what Washington called industrial dumping, a flood of cheap, high-tech cars from China's rapidly advancing EV sector. Canada, wary of being seen as disloyal to its southern ally, followed suit within days. Ottawa imposed identical 100% tariffs on Chinese EV imports, even though Canada had little domestic EV industry to protect. In effect, Canada sanctioned a trade it didn't even compete in a gesture of solidarity rather than strategy. And almost immediately, Beijing retaliated not against cars, but against crops. Tariffs of up to 100% on canola oil and meal, 75.8% on raw seed, additional penalties on pork and seafood. A carefully targeted counterstrike is China hit, where it would hurt the most Western Canada's agricultural heartland. What followed was predictable, though no less painful. Shipments slowed, prices plunged, storage silos filled. The hum of processing plants turned into uneasy silence. Entire rural towns from Saskatchewan to Manitoba began to feel the chill of economic isolation. Farmers pleaded for relief, subsidies, or simply an end to a conflict they never started. And then, months later, came Beijing's quiet note. Lift your EV ban and we lift ours. A single move that could free nearly $5 billion worth of Canadian exports. For the premiers of Saskatchewan and Manitoba, it sounded like salvation. For policymakers in Ottawa, it sounded like a trap. You see, Canada's dilemma is not just about trade. It's about sovereignty inside an economic alliance. By mirroring Washington's tariff policy, Ottawa has effectively outsourced a piece of its foreign policy, and now China is calling that bluff. Accept the offer, and Canada risks fracturing its North American solidarity. Refuse it, and Western Canada continues to bleed economically. It's the kind of moral arithmetic that governments dread because either answer offends someone essential. Ontario's industrial base depends on U.S. auto markets and fears Chinese competition. Western Canada's farms depend on Chinese demand and fear bankruptcy. Both are pillars of the same nation, yet they now find themselves pulling in opposite directions. In this sense, the Golden Deal isn't just a trade offer, it's a mirror. It reflects the fractures within Canada's own economy, long papered over by talk of national unity and free trade. A nation that once prided itself on balancing East and West, industry and agriculture, now stands exposed, dependent on powers it cannot fully control and divided by interests it cannot easily reconcile. As Prime Minister Mark Carney prepares for what may become the most consequential foreign policy decision of his tenure, the question is no longer whether Canada can afford to anger Beijing or Washington. The real question is whether Canada can still afford to call its trade policy its own. Before jumping into the geopolitics, let's pause on the human side, the quieter crisis unfolding beyond the capital, because trade disputes don't play out in press conferences, they play out in people's lives. Drive through the prairies today and you'll see it, the subtle decay of towns that once fed the world, empty grain elevators, silent rail yards, processing plants running at half capacity. In places like Brandon, Dauphin, and Moose Jaw, the canola industry isn't just a business. It's the heartbeat of community life, the sponsor of local hockey teams, the funder of small town schools, the payroll behind the local credit union. When Beijing's tariffs hit, they didn't just strike at corporate profits. They ripped through the economic fabric of rural Canada. Farmers who once shipped thousands of tons of seed to Asia now watch their silos overflow with unsold grain. Some have begun liquidating equipment to stay afloat. Others are taking second jobs. The irony, of course, is that these same farmers are paying the price for a tariff war they never supported, one fought over electric cars they can't even afford to buy. Let's be clear. Canada's agriculture sector was collateral damage in a geopolitical contest between two superpowers, a proxy battle dressed as trade policy. And the result is a growing resentment in the West, not just toward Beijing, but toward Ottawa. Many see the capital's obedience to Washington's tariff line as proof that Canada's economic independence exists mostly in theory. That's why the Golden Deal resonates so powerfully out west. For farmers and local officials, it's not about China or EVs. It's about respect. It's about being heard in a system that too often treats Western livelihoods as expendable. Let us sell again. One Saskatchewan grain cooperative leader said recently, let us breathe. Those aren't the words of opportunists. They're the words of survival. But let's step back and look at the macro logic behind this standoff. China's counter tariffs weren't random acts of retaliation. They were precision strikes targeting the economic geography of Canadian politics. Beijing understands something that Washington often underestimates, that Canada's unity is economic before it is political. You weaken the flow of trade between its regions and you weaken the federation itself. So when China offers to lift tariffs in exchange for EV access, it's not simply offering relief, it's probing for fault lines. Can Ottawa resist when every month of defiance costs billions and drives rural discontent? And if it can't, what message does that send about North America's supposed united front? Now let's turn east to Ontario, the other half of this story. In Windsor, Oakville, and Oshawa, workers remember what happened the last time Canada opened its auto sector to foreign competition. In the 1990s and early 2000s, waves of deindustrialization swept through these towns. Factories closed, jobs vanished. Communities built on generations of manufacturing pride watched their prosperity outsourced. That memory still lingers in union halls and family kitchens. So when Ontario's premier warns that lifting the EV tariff would be economic suicide, he isn't just repeating talking points. He's channeling fear. Fear that another wave of cheaper, more advanced Chinese vehicles could crush what's left of Canada's auto base. The irony, though, is almost too sharp to ignore. Canada imposed the tariff to protect an industry that, by all accounts, is already dependent on U.S. supply chains, U.S. investors, and U.S. consumer demand. In other words, a sector that calls itself Canadian but runs on American arteries. Here's the paradox. Western Canada is demanding sovereignty through trade with China, while Central Canada defends sovereignty by clinging to the U.S. market. Both claim patriotism, both fear dependence, yet both are in practice dependent on someone else's decisions. This is the silent contradiction of the Canadian economy. A nation proud of its independence, yet structurally tied to foreign giants on either side. Now, consider what's happening south of the border. America's own farmers, once the beneficiaries of China's massive appetite for soybeans, have watched that market evaporate. Since 2024, Chinese imports of U.S. soy have collapsed by nearly 100%, replaced almost entirely by Brazilian suppliers. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, that shift costs American farmers over $9 billion annually. So while Washington celebrates economic nationalism, its own heartland is wilting. The same rhetoric that promised to protect American workers has instead isolated them. Fields across Iowa and Nebraska are now filled with unsold harvests, while South American exporters reap the benefits. And in that vacuum, China sees opportunity, replacing American soy with Brazilian and now potentially replacing U.S. agriculture with Canadian. That's not coincidence, that's strategy. It's called diversification, and Beijing has mastered it. By rotating suppliers, China insulates itself from Western pressure while simultaneously creating new leverage. It can reward one ally and punish another, all through market access. Canada's Golden Deal is a textbook example. It's not about cars and crops, it's about influence, about reshaping trade networks in a world where loyalty costs more than tariffs. Beijing isn't just reopening markets, it's rewriting the script of economic power. The real question now is, will Canada play by that script or write its own? Because the choice before Ottawa isn't just a trade negotiation. It's a referendum on independence. Accept Beijing's offer and risk Washington's wrath. Reject it and risk your own farmers' collapse. Either path reveals a hard truth that middle powers no longer control their economic destinies. They navigate between empires, not beside them. Now let's move to the political theater, because in Canada, trade is never just trade. It's identity, it's alliance, it's survival. Inside Parliament Hill, the debate over Beijing's Golden Deal has split the political landscape in ways few could have predicted. The government of Prime Minister Mark Carney is walking a tightrope so narrow that a single misstep could collapse years of diplomatic balancing. On one side stand the Western premiers, vocal, angry, and increasingly defiant. Their provinces, rich in farmland but short on patience, accuse Ottawa of sacrificing their livelihoods on the altar of American loyalty. We are not an appendage of Washington, one Saskatchewan legislator declared recently. We are a sovereign country. Let us act like one. It was a rare moment of rebellion in a federation where regional discontent usually simmers quietly beneath the surface. On the other side stands Ontario, led by Premier Doug Ford, the loudest defender of the EV tariff. His argument rests on a simple political equation: protecting the jobs that win elections. Ontario's manufacturing sector, heavily concentrated around the automotive corridor from Windsor to Oshawa, is not just an economic engine, it's the voter base that decides national power. In Canadian politics, losing Ontario means losing government, and Ford knows it. So while Western farmers plead for market access, Ontario unions plead for protection. Each side frames its cause as patriotism. Each insists the other is selling out the country. And caught between them is the federal government trying to appear decisive while quietly hoping someone else makes the first move. Here's the irony: both camps are responding rationally to a system that isn't. Western Canada depends on exports to survive, so it sees opportunity in China's offer. Ontario depends on manufacturing to survive, so it sees danger. Both are right, and that's the tragedy. Canada's economy is regionally split by design, a legacy of history and geography. It was built to balance competing interests: farms in the West, factories in the East, under one national flag. But globalization has turned that balance into a zero-sum game. Gains for one region now come at the expense of another. And here's where the story turns sharply political. Prime Minister Carney, a man celebrated for his economic intellect and international experience, now faces the kind of dilemma that can define or destroy a political career. If he lifts the EV tariff, he'll be accused of appeasing Beijing and betraying North American solidarity. If he refuses, he risks presiding over a regional economic collapse in the West. Both choices weaken his authority. Both confirm what his critics whisper privately, that Canada's foreign policy is reactive, not strategic. Don't be fooled by the diplomatic phrasing in official statements. Words like constructive engagement and open dialogue are the political equivalent of holding your breath underwater. Everyone is waiting for someone else to blink, first Washington, Beijing, or Ottawa. And each knows the cost of being the first to surface. Meanwhile, in Washington, the pressure campaign has already begun. Senior U.S. trade officials, according to leaks from the Globe and Mail, have quietly warned Ottawa that any softening toward Beijing could trigger review mechanisms under the USMCA. That's bureaucratic code for retaliation. It could mean new inspections on Canadian auto parts or even slowdowns at border crossings. Subtle ways to remind Canada who holds the bigger stick. So let's be honest. Canada is not negotiating in a vacuum. It's negotiating under surveillance by both of its largest trading partners, neither of whom particularly care about the survival of Saskatchewan's canola industry or Ontario's assembly lines. What they care about is alignment, economic alignment, political alignment, ideological alignment. In a world where supply chains are weapons and tariffs are signals, loyalty is the new currency of diplomacy. Here's what that means. When Beijing offers tariff relief, it's not trying to make friends, it's testing boundaries. And when Washington warns against it, it's not defending principle, it's defending monopoly. Canada, stuck between these gravitational forces, has to decide whether it's a planet or a satellite. Let's not forget, this isn't the first time Canada has faced such a choice. In the late 1980 seconds, during the first free trade debates, critics warned that binding the country's economy too tightly to the United States would erode sovereignty. They were right. Over time, trade dependence turned into policy dependence. The logic became simple. What's good for America must be good for Canada, until it wasn't. Today's crisis is the logical outcome of that historical trajectory. Canada's current predicament, being punished by one superpower for obeying another, is the very definition of dependency. It's a reminder that political independence without economic autonomy is little more than theater. And yet, amid all the noise, there's something deeper happening. The idea of Canada as a middle power, pragmatic, rules based, peace seeking is being tested like never before. The very traits that once earned it respect on the world stage now make it vulnerable in an age of economic coercion. You can't be neutral in a tariff war. You can only choose which empire you anger less. The real story then isn't whether Canada accepts the Golden Deal. It's whether Canada still believes it can chart a middle path at all. The ground beneath global trade has shifted. It's no longer about efficiency or comparative advantage. Those classroom concepts have been replaced by strategic rivalry, industrial policy, and digital mercantilism. And for a country that built its identity on moderation, this is a profoundly uncomfortable reality because moderation doesn't win in a world of extremes. Now let's take a broader view because no nation's trade crisis exists in isolation. What's unfolding between Ottawa, Washington, and Beijing is not simply a Canadian drama. It's a window into how mid-sized democracies are being squeezed by the return of global economic blocs. The rules of free trade, once celebrated as universal, are now being rewritten by those powerful enough to ignore them. In Washington, protectionism has become a bipartisan creed. Both Trump and his Democratic rivals have embraced tariffs as tools of national defense, not against military threats, but against competition itself. The logic is simple and cynical. Globalization worked until it didn't serve U.S. interests anymore. Now, the same country that once championed open markets is erecting walls around its own, and when America sneezes, Canada catches the cold. So when Ottawa mirrored Washington's EV tariffs, it wasn't just following a political ally. It was following an outdated script, one written for a world that no longer exists. A world where loyalty was rewarded, alliances were predictable, and economic virtue meant obedience to the rules of someone else's system. That world has vanished. Let's put this into perspective. In 2025, China is no longer just the factory of the world. It's the world's largest automobile exporter, the second largest economy, and the first to dominate both the EV and renewable energy supply chains. BYD, SAIC, and Geely now produce vehicles that rival Tesla in quality but undercut them by 30 to 40% in price. To call them cheap is outdated. They are competitive, efficient, and increasingly local, with factories opening across Asia, Africa, and Europe. When Western leaders talk about protecting jobs, what they're really doing is buying time for their industries to catch up, or at least appear to. The tariff war is not an economic solution. It's a political performance, and Canada, once a quiet believer in open markets, has become an actor, trapped in that performance, repeating lines written in Washington, hoping the audience doesn't notice the contradiction. Because here's the contradiction: Canada claims to defend the principles of free trade while enforcing one of the most protectionist measures in its history, a 100% tariff on EVs it doesn't even produce. This is called efficiency in the make-believe world of Ottawa. The result: a policy that neither protects domestic jobs nor opens new markets, but manages to alienate both China and Western Canada in a single stroke. Meanwhile, Beijing's patience is strategic, not sentimental. Its offer to lift agricultural tariffs is more than a peace gesture, it's a geopolitical test. China has learned that the fastest way to divide Western allies isn't through ideology, but through markets. Offer one country relief, another access, and watch their unity unravel. That's not aggression. That's economic chess. And right now, Canada is the piece in play. This moment also exposes something Western leaders rarely admit: that sanctions and tariffs, once tools of coercion, have become weapons of self-harm. When you close your markets to others, you close them to yourself. When you sanction another's production, you drive up your own costs. The global economy runs on interdependence. Trying to undo that with political slogans is like trying to stop the tide with sandbags. Let's recall a historical parallel. In the 1930 seconds, during the Great Depression, countries reacted to collapsing trade by turning inward: tariffs, quotas, protectionist blocs, each government convinced it could protect itself by shutting others out. The result was not recovery but collapse. Global trade shrank by 2/3. Poverty deepened. Nationalism rose. And within a decade, the world was at war. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And today's economic nationalism is starting to sound eerily familiar. In this light, Beijing's Golden Deal becomes something more than a bilateral test. It's a reflection of the world's new reality, one where every transaction carries a political price tag. For Canada, the decision to reopen agricultural exports in exchange for Chinese EVs isn't just a question of tariffs. It's a question of principle. Do you align your economy with the logic of multipolar trade, or cling to the comfort of a fading unipolar order? Prime Minister Carney, with his background in central banking and international finance, understands this better than most. But understanding doesn't make the choice easier. If he accepts China's offer, he invites Washington's retaliation and domestic outrage in Ontario. If he rejects it, he condemns an entire region's economic lifeline. Either way, he confirms what analysts already whisper: that Canada's famed pragmatism is turning into paralysis. Now, here's something worth reflecting on. Canada has long styled itself as a middle power, a bridge between East and West, a voice of moderation in an age of extremes. But what happens when the bridge itself begins to crumble? What happens when the forces on both ends are pulling so hard that neutrality becomes impossible? The truth is, Canada is discovering the cost of moderation in an immoderate world. A country that once prospered by avoiding choices is now being forced to make one. The global economy no longer rewards balance, it rewards alignment. And the more Canada hesitates, the more its leverage fades. By the way, this story isn't just about economics, it's about democracy, about whether elected leaders still control the levers of national policy or merely react to markets and foreign capitals. When an offer from Beijing can divide an entire federation, that tells us something about where power truly lies. It's no longer in parliaments. It's in supply chains, trade flows, and tariff tables, the invisible architecture of dependence. The paradox couldn't be clearer. Canada wants to be free to choose, but freedom in a globalized economy is expensive. Independence requires investment, patience, and sometimes pain, three things modern politics rarely rewards. So as Ottawa debates the Golden Deal, the world is watching, not because of canola or cars, but because Canada's decision will reveal something deeper about our time. Whether small and medium democracies still have the courage to act on their own convictions, or whether they've become administrators of someone else's strategy. Let's bring this all together, because beneath the politics, tariffs, and sound bites lies a deeper truth about the world we've built and the one we're drifting toward. What's happening between Canada, China, and the United States isn't just a dispute over trade policy. It's a symptom of a global realignment, one where the very idea of sovereignty is being rewritten by economics. Think about it. A generation ago, trade deals were sold as instruments of peace and prosperity. Globalization, we were told, would tie nations together, make wars unthinkable, and lift all boats. But what it actually did was build a world where production and power became inseparable, where whoever controlled supply chains could dictate politics. In that sense, Canada's crisis is not unique. It's just the latest chapter in the story of small nations learning what dependency really means in the 21st century. Let's look at the players. China, through strategy and patience, has built its influence not through invasion or ideology, but through necessity. It doesn't need to win wars. It just needs others to need it. The United States, once the undisputed center of global capitalism, now defends its dominance by restricting others' access in a protectionist empire wrapped in free market rhetoric. And Canada, polite and cautious, is caught between them, discovering that neutrality is a luxury of the past. This moment, then, is more than a policy dilemma, it's a moral test, because every path forward carries a cost, economic, political, or ethical. If Canada takes Beijing's Golden Deal, it risks becoming a wedge in China's campaign to divide the Western alliance. If it refuses, it accepts the continued suffering of its farmers and deepens its subservience to Washington's trade doctrine. Either way, it exposes a painful contradiction, a democracy that cannot act freely because its prosperity depends on the approval of others. That's not an indictment of Canada alone. It's a mirror for every country that calls itself independent while tethered to global capital. When profits depend on foreign markets, when jobs depend on multinational supply chains, when food and technology become bargaining chips, then sovereignty becomes a slogan, not a fact. Let's not forget the human dimension. While leaders argue in conference rooms, the cost is borne by ordinary people, by prairie farmers calculating losses, by factory workers fearing layoffs, by families wondering why economic security always seems to mean insecurity for them. This is how systems protect themselves, by shifting pain downward from the boardroom to the field, from the powerful to the powerless. In the 1,930 seconds, when economic nationalism led to collapse, leaders promised that next time would be different. We've learned our lesson, they said. Never again. But here we are again, repeating history with more data, more bureaucracy, and less accountability. Tariffs, trade wars, protectionism, all wrapped in the flag of patriotism. It's the same old story told with cleaner branding. Don't be fooled by the language of strategic autonomy or economic sovereignty. These are the buzzwords of a system trying to disguise fragility as strength. The real issue isn't whether Canada should choose Beijing or Washington. The real issue is why those are the only choices left. Why can't a nation craft a path based on human need rather than geopolitical obedience? Why can't the economy serve democracy instead of the other way around? Because that's what this moment demands, not just a trade decision, but a reckoning. If democracy means anything, it must mean the ability of a society to choose its own priorities. And if economics means anything, it must mean producing and trading in ways that serve people, not the powerful. Canada's standoff is a microcosm of that global struggle between markets that demand loyalty and citizens who deserve agency. Here's what this all comes down to. The Golden Deal may open trade or deepen dependency. It may revive rural economies or fracture political alliances. But whatever happens, it will reveal how nations navigate a world where every transaction carries a political consequence. The age of free trade is over. We are entering the age of strategic survival. So as Canada's leaders weigh their options, they are really deciding what kind of country they want to be a follower, a partner, or an independent actor willing to endure the cost of autonomy. That decision won't just shape the next election. It will shape the nation's role in a fractured global order where neutrality is an illusion and silence is a stance. Thank you for joining us for this week's edition of the Economic Lens. I look forward to speaking with you again next week as we continue to ask the questions others avoid and examine the economy not as a collection of numbers, but as a mirror of who we are.